So ends the readings. I'd like to start off with some background of myself. Actually, the whole thing is a background of myself. But in 1992, I realized that I had a unique combination of skills that could be used to get more food to more people worldwide. The first, second, sixth, and seventh UU principles suggest that I have to apply these skills, even against opposition. Is this a calling? I started out as an undergraduate studying chemistry and physics, and that gave me an understanding of how things change chemically and physically, actually. That gave me an understanding of the physical world. My graduate studies were in food science, where I learned about food preservation and food systems and was able to apply the chemistry to the food degradation and the physics to the impact and the bruising and the scuffing of food that happens, which loses a lot of food. Then I started working, after I got my doctorate in food science, I specialized in packaging, which allows me to take that state of food that has been protected and maintain it. There is very little food that will stay the way it is without packaging. Actually, I can't think of any. Then I got involved with the international work in 1991, and that segued me into the international distribution of food, where I can understand where it goes and how it gets there and what happens to it on the way. Now, this is where it gets interesting. In 1992, after I had been in 5 countries, so I was an international expert by U.S. standards, which is really strange because everybody else at the conference was like 35 years. But I was invited to be the U.S. representative at the International Symposium on Packaging, Economic Development, and the Environment. And the interesting thing was, this is when everybody was starting to get concerned about waste in general, and since the most visible form of waste is packaging, when it comes to consumer waste, packaging was being attacked, and there were legislation recommendations to ban certain types of packaging. That's when we started recycling and things along those lines. Actually, the Germans started recycling some 20 years before that. But we had all these countries represented at this conference, and we had the developed countries like the United States and Germany and Great Britain and Switzerland, the United Nations. And then we had a bunch of developing countries like the Dominican Republic and a number that were not so. Vietnam was one of them. And the interesting thing was that the developed countries were going there and saying, we got all this packaging waste that we have to do something with. And it was primarily food packaging, by the way. Of all the packaging, 50% of packaging is food. Because there's very few materials that we buy at the rate of 3 times a day for virtually every person, minus the 923 million. So the idea was that we have to do something about this packaging waste. And the representative from Vietnam gets up and says, if you don't want those packaging materials, give them to us, because our food waste is incredible and we need the packaging to protect those food. So that was a wake-up call. And so I started thinking about food science and packaging in terms of looking at the food losses that occur throughout the distribution chain. And most efforts for the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, most of those efforts that were talking about what we can do to reduce hunger were based on production. If we don't have enough food, let's make more. And as I said in one of the readings, we already make twice as much food as the world needs, but a lot of that food never gets into people's mouths. So I started realizing that this combination of chemistry, food, packaging, international trade was a very unique combination. There might be, there's millions of people that know each of those different fields. But there are very, very few that have that one combination. So was this a calling? Can you call an atheist? I was asked to interview for the first endowed professorship of packaging science in the United States, and decided that I really didn't want to move down to South Carolina unless there was something that was really special about coming down here. And I figured with the resources of a land-grant university, I decided that one of the things I will insist on is I will consider the job if the university will let me set up a Center for Global Food Security. And the idea was to get together with microbiology and food science and packaging and economics, agricultural economics and microbiology, a whole bunch of different departments, and look at food after it was produced and find out what happens to that food, find out where the losses occur, and then do research to find out what we can do to cut those losses down. So I got to the university and started a multidisciplinary group. I was from packaging, and there were people from many other groups, some of whom I'm still working with. And that's what got me down here. So that's the first part, and now I'd like to do a song that was written by Tom Paxton. And this really, it's about food, but it's more about food production, which is not my emphasis. But it's a wonderful song, and it's more about the farmers. It's called Who Will Feed the People? And I will get on it as soon as I get my picks on. If they take away my farm, they pull me off the plow. Tell me who will feed the people? Hell, the banker don't know how. It's all pages in a mystery that we'll never understand. Tell me who will feed the people if they pull me off my land? If they call in all my loans, they call the auctioneer. Tell me who will bring the crops in with no farm folk living here? Will the banker run the combine? Will the agent bale the hay? Tell me who will feed the people if they take my farm away? When my great-granddaddy Jacob, 97 years ago, broke the sod behind two oxen, broke his back to make it grow, taught his sons by his example as they taught their sons in turn. What the topsoil tried to teach him, great-granddaddy tried to learn. If they put us on the road, they tell us we must go. Who will come and take our place? Who'll know half the things we know? Who'll know every inch of topsoil as it trickles through the hand? Tell me who will feed the people if they put me off my land? Great-granddaddy Jacob, 97 years ago, broke the sod behind two oxen, broke his back to make it grow, taught his sons by his example as they taught their sons in turn. What the topsoil tried to teach him, great-granddaddy tried to learn. If they take away my farm, they pull me off the plow. Tell me who will feed the people? Hell, the banker don't know how. It's all pages in a mystery that you'll never understand. Tell me who will feed the people if they put me off my land? It's all pages in a mystery that you'll never understand. Tell me who will feed the people if they put me off my land? Thank you. Okay. 1999, there was I mentioned earlier about the Budapest Convention, which was the Budapest Declaration that came out of the World Food Congress 9 in 1995. And that's where we first came up with the declaration that we're going to reduce hunger by half by 2015. Well, in 1999, they had the next World Food Congress. And remember I mentioned Joe Hulse earlier? Well, Joe Hulse was the gentleman who led the Budapest Congress, the World Food Congress in 1995. And he was the one who brought food security to the consciousness of everybody. And he was supposed to chair the food security section of the World Food Congress 10 in 1999. And he got sick and had to go to the hospital. And a guy by the name of Alistair Hicks from Thailand, because he was in Bangkok at the time, drove up the wrong way on one of the busiest streets in Bangkok and brought Joe Hulse to the hospital. And they asked me to take over the section on food security. I was going to be a speaker at the Congress, but they asked me to take over the food security. So this was a major honor, I thought. But I didn't really have support locally to do this. So I had a choice of either doing food security or having the security of a position here in Clemson. So if this is a calling, it wasn't a local call. So I went to the World Food Congress, and I spoke about food losses in general, post-harvest food losses, and how we can study them, basically the idea that I had for the Center for Global Food Security. And I brought that in as an emphasis to start people thinking about post-harvest food losses in the World Food Congress. Now, the World Food Congress is put on by a conglomeration of food technology groups in many, many different countries. And I think there are a little over 60 countries that are members of the International Union of Food Science and Technology that sets up these World Food Congresses. So I presented there that let's start talking about post-harvest. And I think I was the first one at one of those congresses to do so. The following year, I made a presentation to the World Bank about post-harvest stuff. And what I found out is lots of people were interested in what I had to say. But the interesting thing about the World Bank is it consists of agronomists and economists, and there wasn't a food science in the whole building. So they were sympathetic, but they didn't really understand what I was trying to do. A couple of years later, I represented the U.S. and the packaging industry at the World Food Summit in the World Food Summit 5 years later in 2002. Now, the World Food Summit 5 years later was 6 years later, but the reason it was 6 years later is it was supposed to be in November of 2001, 2001, and you might remember that something happened in the United States around September of 2001, so it sort of made a real mess of all schedules, and the entire world was sympathetic to the United States at that time, and the World Food Summit was held off by another year. And the idea for that, Dr. Duff was still the Secretary General of FAO at that time, and he wanted the 5 years later Congress because we weren't doing enough, we weren't going to meet the goal, and we had to do something. That's the first time I believe he said the business as usual. He repeated that in the quote that I gave earlier about the 10 years. And I made a presentation to FAO during that summit. Now, I was not in the main summit at the time. I was one of the representatives from a non-government organization. I was not a U.S. representative that was in the main hall. So I made this presentation to FAO during that summit. And I spoke to the people at FAO that were interested in post-harvest. Now, I said that the emphasis was on production and not on post-harvest. I think you recall that. And when I say the emphasis was on production, they had 5,000 employees at FAO, and I believe there were 5 that were working on post-harvest. I know the 3 head ones, but I think they had a couple of assistants. So I'll be generous and say 5. So you're talking about 1/10 of 1% of a major organization is working on post-harvest. All the rest are on production. Now keep that in mind because that's going to come up again. So very, very little in the way of post-harvest. In 2003, there was the World Food Congress 12, and I met a gentleman by the name of, I didn't meet him there, I already knew him, but Alistair Hicks, who was the guy who drove Joe Hulse to the hospital that let me be the head of the food security section, spoke with me at this Congress, and he pointed out, he brought a whole bunch of pictures. And in these pictures, it was absolutely obvious that there would be somebody in the front at the podium or wherever, and often a man, and someplace in the audience there was a woman, and everybody was sort of referring to this woman because she was the real leader. The guy was the guy who was saying the things, but it was the woman that was the leader. And in fact, when you're trying to reduce world hunger, you go to the women. Now, it might be a little bit more difficult in the Muslim countries, but you primarily go to the women because they're the ones that are going to get food to their family and the people, whereas if you give food to men, they'll eat themselves, they'll feed themselves first and then go to the family. So the emphasis when you're doing these things should be on the women. And Alistair showed me these pictures, and as I said, once it's pointed out, it was absolutely obvious. So at the World Food Congress in 2003, the Congress 12, I started adding an emphasis to implementing the food security programs with women as opposed to only with men. Okay, obviously you have to use both. In 2004, I was invited to go to Sri Lanka for a short course on post-harvest. Some of the people I've spoken with over the years thought that this was interesting, and they started a 2-day course in post-harvest technology in Sri Lanka, and they invited me to Colombo to speak for that course. And this was where it gets interesting. After the course, they asked me if I would like to visit their Institute of Post-Harvest Technology. Now, I've been in the field for some 30 years, and I didn't know they had an Institute of Post-Harvest Technology anywhere. That's what I tried starting in the United States. So when I picked myself off the floor, I said, what Institute of Post-Harvest Technology? And turns out that the guy who invited me there, his daughter worked there. So there was, very good relationships here. So I went and visited this institute, and I found they were working on some 35 projects, and they showed them to me, and they were fantastic stuff. They were doing precisely what I was proposing to do in the United States. They were looking at food distribution. They were finding appropriate ways to fix those food distribution problems. And the reason I use the word appropriate is what they were doing might not be anything what we do in the United States. High technology is our mantra, but appropriate technology is much more useful. So since I have enough time to do this, I'm going to point out when I did some work in Malaysia, they were packaging bottles of, it was either soy sauce or a hot sauce. It was some type of sauce in 1-liter bottles, approximately 1 quart. They were packaging, Malaysia is very hot and very humid. So if you use a corrugated box like we use in the United States, the thing would go, okay? It would not last. They were wrapping these things in twine. And they had, primarily women, would go, and they could package 12 bottles such that you can lift it up and they didn't jingle in as much time as it take us to put 12 bottles into a shipping container, into a corrugated box. Absolutely amazing. So I go to Sri Lanka and I'm visiting this center and finding out that they're doing all this wonderful stuff. And I'm going to point out with packaging. When I say packaging, I'm talking about the packaging that's directly around the product as well as what they call transport packaging. Like if you take, they did a study in Sri Lanka that they found out that the percentage of fresh produce that was destroyed in transit to the central market in Dambulla was between 22 and 28%. Now, why is it so high? Well, they take the produce and they put it in basically 50-pound bags, and they pile it up in the truck, and they're driving along and hit a pothole, and you now have pulp in the bottom of the truck. So if you put those same pieces of produce and put them in a crate, you've got this much pressing on the bottom with the crates piled up as opposed to that much. So you cut the damage, and they measured it, and the damage was cut from between 22 and 28 to 5%. That's the type of stuff I'm talking about. So you multiply 20% reduction by the total production of fresh produce in Sri Lanka, and you're talking about a big number. Okay, following year I went to Thailand, and I gave 2 seminars. One was, give you the story on that one too. Jan was working at the university, and she had a 1-month sabbatical in Bangkok at Mahidol University. And I was going to visit her the last week, and then we were going to have a week going around Thailand ourselves and having a little bit of fun. So since I was slumming it, I went with T-shirts and shorts. And while I was there, I decided to visit Alistair Hicks, who worked for the FAO. He was one of their 3 post-harvest officers. And I went down to Alistair and chatted with him, and he decided that I should be introduced to the guy who brought food science into Thailand. And that was Dr. Naren up in Chiang Mai. And Jan and I had talked about possibly going to Chiang Mai, but we weren't sure whether we were going to do it. And the first words out of Naren's mouth were, could he, when Alistair introduced me, he said, could he come up and give a couple of seminars in Chiang Mai? Well, and it wasn't because of me. It wasn't my reputation. It was, if Alistair is introducing me, I got to be okay. So Jan and I flew up to Chiang Mai, went to the night market, ordered a suit. Following day, I gave 2 seminars. One was packaging to protect, preserve, and add value to food. And the second one was feeding the world within our grasp. And it was about post-harvest institutes. And then Naren introduced me to the Thai Institute of Post-Harvest Technology. It was actually in 3 universities. And absolutely amazing. So all of this stuff is going on. And the Sri Lankan Institute is publishing in Sinhalese. The Thai Institute is publishing in Thai. They showed me this wonderful way of cutting losses of, when you take rice out of a paddy, the losses are tremendous. And they had a machine that dropped the losses from something like 25% down to 2%. And the guy proudly shows me the article in Thai. Pretty pictures. But I didn't really understand it. So I came up with the idea that if many, many countries, and I started doing some web searches and found out that many countries have these institutes, a lot of whom don't publish in English because they don't have any budget for international courses anyway, and they're primarily interested in their own countries because they need the food. So I came up with the idea that what would happen if we could promote international cooperation of these institutes, maybe translate some of their papers, and promote appropriate technologies where they fit from one country to the other. And I'm going to these World Food Congresses, and there with scientists representing some 60-some-odd countries. And I start asking them, would you be willing to help transfer technology from one country to another? And they said, sure. This is all volunteer. And we came up with an idea that if the question is asked and they know the solution, in other words, it's technology that exists. And I'll give you an example in just a moment. Would they be willing to answer phone calls, emails, letters for free? And they said, absolutely. Count me in. And to give you an example, got a call from a buddy in Ghana, and he said, you guys keep bananas for a long time. We have bananas that ripen very quickly, and they're good for 3 days, and then we throw them out. How do you keep the bananas better for a longer period of time? And the answer is very simple. In the green state, they last for months. In the yellow state, they last for days. So if you keep them in the green state, you can store them that way, and then you gas them with what you need, which is ethylene. Ethylene is a growth hormone that triggers the ripening process. And you'll find it absolutely coincidental that if you go into the supermarket, all the bananas are about the same level of ripening. Absolute magic. So I told Kofi this, and he said, yeah, but how do you do it? What do you scrub it with, and how much ethylene do you hit them with? So I called up a plant physiologist at Rutgers, and they said, hey, Chaim, how do you do this? And he says, well, you scrub it with potassium permanganate, and you gas it with 1 part per million, and here's the equipment you do it with. And I sent that on to Ghana. That's the type of thing I'm talking about. Took no real research on the part of Chaim to come up with that number. Now, if I ask him to adapt the technology, he gets a consulting fee, because nobody's going to volunteer forever without any kind of a return. And if there is a problem that does not have a solution, my proposal was that the country that needed this solution would get one of their best students to come to graduate school and do a master's or doctorate thesis on that technology. And then it would be written that if the student returns and implements, it was a grant, and if the student doesn't, it was a loan. So there's no downside from the point of the countries that are going to do this. And then I would ask these volunteers voluntarily if they would give seminars and write articles and things like that. So if they were going to be part of my volunteer network, they had to agree to the first one. The rest were all voluntary. So we ended up with a system, cheap labor. Okay, so now we have a volunteer group that is willing to help with the transfer of technology. The technologies already exist, and the food already exists. So we're talking about a very cheap way of recovering a lot of food. And my estimates were that if we recovered 1/10 of 1% within 3 years, we could feed 30 million people for a year. 1/10 of 1% of the losses. With the volunteer scientists and all that, the fact that the food exists, it's cheap. Wow. I'm talking about feeding people for between $5 and $10 a year. Okay? Not magic. The food exists. The technology exists. It's just a matter of putting them together. So I looked for support from governments and foundations, and I wrote lots and lots of letters. And I'm a slow learner, but I found out that all agencies get more requests than they can handle. So what they do is they write guidelines, and if you meet the guidelines, they go into the organization, and if you don't meet the guidelines, somebody in the front office, before it gets into the organization, says, "Thank you very much, we wish you luck in the program, but we don't fund that." And I found out that since nobody ever thought of this program before, it didn't fit anybody's guidelines. So I continued anyway. Is that a calling, or is it just plain dumb? Okay, 2006, there was another World Food Congress. I was the only American invited to speak at the Symposium on Global Responsibility. I think that has a couple things to do with the United States was doing some nasty things at the time, and also the symposium was held in France. So, I don't remember when we were talking about the American fries, but okay. But in any case, I talked about the global food security. That was where I introduced the idea, forget about doing the research myself. Let's talk about international cooperation of these different organizations that already exist. Later on, I was introduced by a guy by the name of Alistair Hicks in Thailand. It's a small group. He came up with a program through the United Nations called Economic Development Through Village Food Processing. Now, the idea is that you have a lot of food waste. Now, you can use, if you recover that food waste, you can use it to feed people. Now, sometimes you can't get it to people well enough. Let's take those bananas that they had in Ghana. You got 3 days to use it. You can't distribute bananas in 3 days. What happens if you chop those bananas up and you fry them and you put them in a polyethylene bag with a label on the top, and you now sell them for more money than it costs to get those bananas? Okay? You now have the start for cottage industries in the rural areas of developing countries. This was Alistair's idea. And he was introducing it to Africa, and I know it's already been successful in 5 countries in Southeast Asia. Okay. And the idea was that they had a kit, they had a manual that told people about basic food sanitation and basic food processing. And they had a kit that had a processor, a pressure cooker, and a mosquito net to keep bugs and flies off of the food, and a drying rack, a couple of very basic stuff. And that kit was about $100 worth of stuff. Now, $100 is not a big investment for people starting companies in the United States, but it's a major investment for people in the developing world. So Alistair came up with this idea that if you teach 10 people in the operation of this kit, you get a kit. Now, I call it a Ponzi scheme. He hates it when I say that. But the bottom line is that it spread very quickly, and you ended up having a very, very substantial impact for virtually no investment. So that was a contribution. So I added the economic development through village food processing into the mix of what I'm trying to do with the global food security. And I don't remember exactly when it was, but I was at a Institute of Food Technology National Convention, and I was asked to join a group called the Global Harmonization Initiative. GHI for short. Now, what GHI is doing is they're trying to get rid of food regulations that have nothing to do with safety. Believe it or not, there was a law in the European Union that you could not sell curved cucumbers. I see some wonderful expressions. Okay. Curved cucumbers don't sit well in the supermarket shelves. They don't stack. So there was a law against curved cucumbers. So the farmers would get the curved cucumbers and roll them right back into the soil, and whatever was curved never made it to market. Okay? The European Union has since repealed that law because it was stupid, but the supermarkets like straight cucumbers, so it's a de facto standard at this point. There are no curved cucumbers in Europe. The United States has a law that unless peaches are a certain size, they could not be shipped in interstate trade. So, believe it or not, there is one county, Gaffney County in South Carolina, that produces more peaches than the entire peach state next to us. Okay? Just interesting. But tons of those would be sorted out, taken out because they were too small, and thrown away, dumped in a landfill. Don't know if they still are, but when I was at Clemson, I was going to see if I can do something about that problem. But, so I don't know what happened after that. But in any case, the idea of GHI is to take regulations, harmonize those regulations across countries, and make sure those regulations are based on food safety and not on anything else. Okay, 2009 came along, and FAO announced that hunger had passed 1 billion people worldwide. It's now lower. Part of that reason was you ended up with a spike in food prices, the 2008 recession. Food prices went up. People could not afford to buy food, so the number of hungry people increased. It's come down a little bit. 2010, there was the World Food Congress, 15, and I started talking about food security, a function of food production, delivery, and regulations, and I might have added in the economic development at that point, but I'm not positive. In 2011, there was a Save Food Congress in Germany. This is an international symposium on safe food. Now, here's where it really gets interesting. FAO made a presentation of 2 major reports where they talked about post-harvest food losses and waste. Complete turnaround from when I made the presentation when they had 0.1%. Now it's a major report. Now, this was a major conference. The conferences this was related to, it was a bad year because the economy was down. They only had 166,000 registrants. The one before that was 179. So this is a big show. So this is a big deal when FAO is making this presentation. It was a very significant. Okay, the number they came up with was that there are 1.3 billion tons of food waste in the world per year. That's 1/3 of production overall. Now, that's overall. There are places where there are some products, some produce that's 90%. There's some that are 50%, all over the place. But it was a significant number. The interesting thing was that they did both losses and waste, and they found out that losses and waste in the developed world and the developing country were about comparable. Surprised the heck out of me, okay? What's happening is in the developing world, you're talking about the distribution of goods, and they get lost through rats, through bruising, through rain, through all kinds of things in that chain of the distribution before it gets to the consumer. In the United States and the European Union, it's primarily after it gets to the consumer. Our wastes are amazing. You've seen it at banquets. But in your house, who here throws out milk when it hits the best buy date? Okay, one. How about canned foods? Okay, I got a good group here. Okay, a lot of people will throw out milk when it hits the best buy date. When we were younger, some of us know this, that the way we told whether the milk was good is and if it smelt sour, we threw it out, and if it didn't, we drank it. Okay? Best buy dates were irrelevant. Canned foods. The Army can keep canned foods for 10 years. Okay? Canned foods don't go bad. If the can starts exploding, get rid of it. Short of that, it's good. Okay? So we waste a tremendous amount of food, and some of it can be fixed just by educating people that those best buy dates are guidelines. If you happen to be a food company, are you going to be conservative with that best buy date or liberal with that best buy date? You want people to replace the food. So those dates are very conservative. They allow the food to be sitting in a truck at 140 degrees in the summertime in the South and still be okay. So they're very conservative numbers. Let me see. 2012 came along, and there was, believe it or not, another World Food Congress down in Brazil. And I added the concept of waste and the economic development. So I now was talking about food loss, food waste, regulations, economic development, and then I gave a separate talk on sustainability. So that brings us up to 2012. I'm afraid I don't have much for 2013 except a visiting professorship in Vietnam. But so I continue. Is it a calling? Whatever. It became a passion, not quite in the same sense as Mel Gibson, but with an unshakable conviction that I have a set of skills to make an impact in this particular area, and not doing so would be, in the words of Steve Martin, a dirty, rotten shame. If I get discouraged, I cannot quit. Sounds like a calling, but from whom? Thank you.